In the 1950s, America had broken free from the shackles of wartime economics. It was walking with the swagger of a nation that had the world by the tail. Scientists had harnessed nuclear energy. Jet-propelled airplanes were breaking speed records, and the race to space was on. But perhaps more than anything else, one thing melded imagination and consumerism, putting this era in perfect context. The concept car. Unlike satellites, rockets, and jet planes, these dream cars were accessible. People flocked to auto shows to see concept cars in their titanium-bodied glory. They were snapshots of how America perceived its future. They were simply out of sight, unforgettable. But what happened to them? Most were destroyed. Some just plain vanished. But amazingly, some are still here.
We got this from General Motors directly, and someone at General Motors must have said, this is too cool to put through the crusher, let's give it to a museum.
This car ended up in South America. It was painted a kind of a gold color. The grille was slightly changed. A couple of other details were changed, but fortunately it survived. It was deemed important enough to keep and rescue and not throw away.
Reintroducing the 1956 Buick Centurion and the 1954 Plymouth Explorer. (1956). The Cold War is heating up. At Florida's Cape Canaveral, an American military rocket is used for a test launch into suborbit. The Bell X-2 research aircraft sets a new altitude record. That same aircraft turns Air Force test pilot Milburn Apt into the first man to travel 3 times the speed of sound. Speed is power, and GM is ready to launch a rocket of its own.
Now, the dream cars of tomorrow.
Buick presents the sleek Centurion.
Driving Coat by Montesano of New York.
One year before the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first space satellite, Buick designed a concept car that heralded the space race. The 1956 Buick Centurion.
There's to use a social science word, the zeitgeist. There's a feeling in the time, something in the air, and people just react to it, and they start creating all this wonderful stuff. There was nothing like this car at the time. Its styling was so futuristic. I keep thinking of the Jetsons TV program. You can't help but think of the Jetsons when you look at that. I think of spaceships. I think of Wernher von Braun, of Atlas rockets heading off into the sky, of just of space and space travel. This was a car to show off the very best design. Now, this was post-World War II. The first concept cars had been done. This was taking advantage of all the new technologies and the whole new design style. This car is very reminiscent of an airplane, also of rockets. So it was taking the very best of forward-thinking design as well as, to a certain extent, technology, although it's more about a styling exercise and showing the wow factor that their designers could create.
Designer Chuck Jordan and his team at General Motors wanted to strike the right chord at the right time. They knew enough about the car-buying public to take their cues from the world of aeronautical design.
The most unique feature of the Buick Centurion is its transparent roof. With the jet fighter influence, it enabled folks to have a very nice view of their surroundings. The only problem was it let in UV, created a lot of heat, and folks got really hot in this car. So the fix, a couple of air intake vents at the front of the cowl, which allowed air into the vehicle through the roof line and exited out the rear vent. The hubcap on the Buick Centurion is also very similar on aeronautical type equipment. It's not only stylish, but yet functional. As the vehicle is rotating, it's designed to pull air into the brakes and help cool the brakes for increased stopping. Each one of these vanes is attached with a couple of fasteners, painstakingly put together, each hubcap. Not only aircraft innovation on the exterior, but on the interior as well. The Centurion was equipped with a unique selector for the transmission, as well as a speedometer that actually rotated rather than the needle moving, similar to what you'd see in a jet fighter. As well as the very cool AM radio and its unique design. The biggest feature on this car was its backup camera system. This car was equipped with no mirrors, so it had a camera to take a look at everything that's going on behind you. This feature was so far ahead of its time. Here it is, some 50 years later, that we are just now seeing this show up in production vehicles. Under the hood of the Buick Centurion is a 322 cubic inch production V8 with side draft Carter carburetors and a custom-built intake manifold, highly polished and a lot of chrome for show. There's no provisions to put fuel in this engine. There's no gas tank.
This car looked really fast, but how do you put gas into a car with no gas tank? The 1956 Buick Centurion has aerodynamic design. It has a V8 engine, but it doesn't have a gas tank. It's not solar. It's not electric. In fact, it didn't even move. If anyone had designs on testing out the Centurion's horsepower, they were going to have to use real horses. This car looked sleek and fast standing still, because that's all it did. With no fuel tank, the only place this car was going to rocket was through the imagination of the car-buying public. The 1956 Buick Centurion certainly had the celestial wow factor, but practicality wasn't a strong suit.
Bubble tops are not practical in any way, shape, or form. Think of it in a rainstorm, think of it in a rollover accident, and as yet, no one has figured out how to make the bubble top safe. The styling of it, the technological innovations simply were not something that were going to show up in production cars. Production car has to be designed to take into cognizance production costs, material costs, and so they had to really think that through. The concept cars were one of a kind, as this Centurion is. And it was just great advertising for General Motors. It showed off their ability of their designers.
Years later, Buick would go on to mass produce a car dubbed the Centurion. But it wasn't the type of car that George Jetson would drool over.
It shared a name. The mark or the name was the only thing that it shared, and that was pretty typical of General Motors. They'd bring out a name and they might use it later on, or they might not. As a matter of fact, when the Centurion was finally produced as a mark, it looked nothing like this car.
The final production version of the Centurion had a very short run, from 1971 to 1973. But the 1956 concept car captured the hearts and minds of car enthusiasts and of the company that designed it. GM insiders with kind souls shepherded the Centurion through the decades, sparing it from peril, before leaving it in the protective hands of the Alfred P. Sloan Museum in Flint, Michigan.
We know very little about what actually happened with this car. Many of the concept cars were just put in storage, and General Motors, as all automotive companies, are there to make money. And once this wow factor, its utility as a concept car, a dream car, passed, very often they were either crushed, discarded, stuck away in warehouses. We got this from General Motors directly, and someone at General Motors must have said, this is too cool to put through the crusher, let's give it to a museum. The Centurion and all concept cars, I think, really need to be saved because they tell you so much about a particular time period, about its art, its design, what people thought was important, the technology of the time. In fact, Buick's head engineer at one time said that his business was to make today's models obsolete tomorrow. And that's essentially what these cars were doing.
Big and beautiful. Outlandish and outrageous. Unimaginable and unforgettable. These are the concept cars of the mid-20th century. Love them or not, one look and it's hard to look away. But why? What makes these concept cars, above all others, so unique?
It's very popular to look back at the cars of the 1950s and say, my God, they're big and they're garish, and why did we do that? But you got to put yourself in the 1950s.
The 50s and 60s really was a one-of-a-kind automotive era, never to be repeated. When you think of the circumstances, you can understand why. The war was over, America emerged victorious.
It was after the cataclysm of the Depression and World War II, prosperity came back to America. Houses were being built, consumer goods were available. It was a time of great optimism.
They'd known deprivation and sacrifice, and by God, they were going to get some reward for their sacrifice. And if it meant a big car painted turquoise and green that was 19 feet long and had tail fins, well, damn it, so what? That's what I want. I deserve it.
And Americans couldn't wait for the future to get here, and cars embodied that.
The future was always going to be better. The future was always going to be cooler than today.
Detroit manufacturers seized upon that idea, and they started giving people little hints of the future, little ideas of what might be coming down the road.
A magnificent Eldorado town car by Cadillac.
When the concept cars were no longer useful to Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, I think those companies would much prefer to have seen them destroyed. They didn't want to worry about the liability. They didn't want their old concept cars getting in the wrong hands. They didn't want the hassle. They just wanted them to go away, and they wanted to move on.
Oldsmobile's elegant golden rocket.
Now that the years have gone by, 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the road, I think the manufacturers feel a little bit flattered and a little bit honored that people pay such high esteem to their cars. Anxious collectors are out there looking for them to restore them to their original glory. I think it's important to preserve cars and let people see them so they can understand where they've been, and understanding where you've been can help a whole lot in understanding where you're going.
While other companies wanted to take car enthusiasts to the moon, Chrysler took car enthusiasts on a slightly different expedition.
Plymouth was considered a stodgy car in the day, and Plymouth really needed something to sex up their line. After World War II, European styling was really where it was at. It was longer, it was lower, it was wider, it was clean, it was fresh. This car was more about design than it was about technology.
For Plymouth, the future of style was about space and about Europe. The 1954 Plymouth Explorer, lost and found again. (1954). In America, trends are changing. Jet planes and the space race are capturing the imagination of the nation. The golden era of concept cars has arrived. Tail fins are huge and rocket ship inspired. Engine technology turns turbine. While the rest of Detroit looks to the stars for inspiration, Chrysler looks across the pond. Buyers are hungry for European style, exotic color, fabrics, tailored sophistication is hot, but the stylistas aren't the only ones catching the wave. This is the 1954 Plymouth Explorer.
This car was designed so that Chrysler's Plymouth division can show it at auto shows and attract attention to the rest of their line. Today we call them concept cars, but back then they called them dream cars. And lots of, just about every major American manufacturer would build these kinds of vehicles.
The early 1950s, the fight for market share in the automobile industry is raging. At the top of the heap, General Motors and Ford are duking it out. Over at Chrysler, sales are declining. The company needs an image overhaul, and Plymouth is the prime target.
Plymouth was considered a stodgy car in the day, and Plymouth really needed something to sex up their line. Most people up until this time had looked at Plymouths and just considered them kind of very conservative cars, the kinds of cars that old men wearing hats would drive. And they understood that the market was getting younger and younger, and they wanted their cars to look more the part.
Designers at Chrysler knew that beating GM and Ford at their own game would be a tall order. They needed to find a way to differentiate themselves from their competitors. The plan? Design a series of eye-popping concept cars, but not just any concept cars. Chrysler wanted to combine space-age trends with true European exotica. So they approached Ghia, one of the most famous Italian automobile design and coach building firms, and asked them to lend a hand.
Chrysler liked to have a family resemblance to its cars, but they also really appreciated, almost more than any other American manufacturer, the Italian style and wanted to give their cars a very European look. After World War II, European styling was really where it was at. It was longer, it was lower, it was wider, it was clean, it was fresh. European design relied more on the form of an object than applied ornamentation. American design took a car, took a basic body, and then put chrome on it here, there. Let's put these taillights here, let's put these bezels on here, and let's put this giant grille. Whereas Italian cars, you see very little chrome trim in comparison to what you've seen on American cars. Literally, they relied more on the shape than the decoration. This car has so many unusual and distinctive features embodied that it's a real study. When you look at this car, some of the more interesting things are not only the sculpted quality of the body, but also the lines on the side. Those white spears aren't applied. They're not trimmed. They're actually hammered into the body. They're a part of the body. You look at the rear of the car also, and back in the days when fins were getting bigger and bigger and bigger, here you show a car that has great restraint. It's very, very concise. It's a nice, fluid, organic design, much different than other Detroit products of the day.
In an era of turbine engine experimentation and technical revelations, the 1954 Plymouth Explorer was different. It was about science, speed, and innovation, but it was also about the intangible too: fashion, flair, and seduction. Every American's continental fantasy. But did it work?
This car gave the whole Plymouth line a certain cachet and a certain desirability that it didn't have before. It's a really brave try in the face of tradition. This car was about attracting attention for Plymouth on the show circuit.
But in the end, widespread admiration would be this mystery car's sole achievement.
This car was not mass-produced. It was never meant to be mass-produced. It was only meant to look good on the auto show circuit for 1 or 2 years at the most, attract all kinds of attention to Plymouth, and then move on. But this car, in its day, nothing was newer than that car. A year later, nothing was older. But there's a lot of things on here that just, because of how this car was built and because of the nature of a one-of-a-kind car, could not have made it onto production cars. There's some lines on this car that you could only achieve by hand hammering in one person at a time individually, that you can't get on a big body press in Detroit.
The 1950s drew to a close. The Plymouth Explorer had exhausted the show circuit. This beautiful concept car was almost lost to the obscurity of private ownership. Fortunately, it was saved from this fate. It's now under the care of the Peterson Automotive Museum in Los Angeles, California.
This car ended up in South America. It was painted a kind of a gold color. The grille was slightly changed. A couple of other details were changed, but fortunately it survived. It was deemed important enough to keep and rescue and not throw away. We don't know exactly the chain of ownership, but the overall sculpturing of the body, the overall flair of the car was retained, and very fortunate that it was.